Accountability and transparency stand as two of the most critical pillars of any functioning democracy, yet time and again we see these values sacrificed when they are most needed. When Representative Jasmine Crockett demands that files be released and those who protect predators be exposed, she is echoing the cry of countless citizens who are tired of cover-ups, secrecy, and the endless shielding of the powerful. The issue of protecting pedophiles is not just a matter of hidden documents or political gamesmanship. It is a test of whether society will choose to prioritize the powerful over the powerless, the abuser over the abused, the corrupt system over the voices of children who have been silenced for too long. Accountability begins with honesty, and honesty cannot exist when files remain locked away, names remain concealed, and evidence remains buried in the dark corners of bureaucracy. Transparency means nothing if it is selective, and it loses all meaning when it becomes a weapon used only against those who are weak while those who wield real influence remain untouched. The call for transparency in this context is not about curiosity or gossip, it is about justice. Every sealed file, every redacted document, every closed-door session that protects those complicit in such crimes is another act of violence against victims. When institutions protect predators instead of exposing them, they signal to society that the lives of children are less valuable than the reputations of the powerful. This not only erodes trust in government but also perpetuates a cycle where abusers believe they can act with impunity. Crockett's demand to release the files is about breaking that cycle once and for all, ensuring that accountability is not just a word thrown around in political speeches, but a practice lived out in tangible, courageous actions. Accountability also requires consequences, not just exposure. It is not enough to identify who protected pedophiles if those individuals continue to walk away untouched, keeping their careers and influence intact. True accountability would mean criminal charges for those who conspired to conceal abuse, resignations from those who allowed corruption to persist, and a broader cultural shift that prioritizes the truth over reputational damage. Transparency is only the first step. The next is ensuring that what is revealed leads to meaningful outcomes. Without this, calls for transparency risk becoming hollow, and victims are re-traumatized by watching yet another performance of outrage that leads nowhere. Representative Crockett's stance shines a light on a larger issue: selective transparency. Governments and institutions often claim to value openness, but their actions reveal a different story. Files that incriminate everyday citizens can be made public in an instant, but files that point toward influential figures are guarded like state secrets. This double standard feeds a culture of cynicism where people lose faith in justice systems entirely. When transparency is weaponized only against those with little power, accountability becomes a farce. Crockett's message challenges this hypocrisy by insisting that accountability must apply equally, regardless of wealth, political influence, or social status. In demanding accountability, we are also forced to examine the cultural reluctance to confront powerful predators. Too often, society dismisses or discredits victims, especially when accusations involve individuals in politics, media, or business. Survivors are asked for impossible amounts of proof while perpetrators are given the benefit of the doubt simply because of their status. Files containing evidence should not be locked away to protect the image of abusers, they should be revealed to ensure that survivors' voices are validated and predators are stripped of the shield of secrecy. The very act of keeping such files sealed sends a clear message, that the dignity of powerful individuals matters more than the innocence of children. This is why transparency in this context is not optional, it is a moral imperative. Accountability also forces us to rethink how institutions handle abuse cases from the beginning. Why were files sealed in the first place? Who made the decision to classify or redact evidence? Who benefits from this silence? These questions go to the heart of systemic corruption. If we cannot hold accountable the very people who protect criminals, then the system itself is complicit. Crockett's demand reminds us that transparency is not just about shining a light on individual predators but on the entire network of enablers, protectors, and decision-makers who allowed them to thrive in the shadows. Accountability means unraveling the entire chain of corruption, from the abuser to those who knowingly covered for them. Furthermore, accountability and transparency restore trust. something society desperately needs. Citizens do not lose faith in government because of the exposure of corruption, they lose faith because corruption is hidden, ignored, or excused. When institutions release files, confront the truth, and take responsibility, they rebuild the bridge between the people and those in power. Justice delayed or denied creates suspicion, while justice carried out openly and fairly strengthens democracy. By releasing files and holding individuals accountable, leaders can demonstrate that no one is above the law, that the innocent will be protected, and that secrecy will no longer serve as a refuge for the guilty. This demand for transparency also extends beyond politics and into the wider culture. Media organizations, corporations, and social institutions must be held to the same standard. For too long, scandals involving abuse have been buried by powerful interests, settlements have been made in secrecy, and perpetrators have quietly moved on to new positions of power. Accountability means dismantling this culture of silence across all sectors, not just within Congress. Transparency requires a commitment to truth at every level of society. Crockett's statement calls for a reckoning that will reach beyond the walls of government and into the very fabric of how society handles abuse, power, and secrecy. Lastly, accountability is not an act of revenge but a necessary step toward healing. Victims cannot begin to heal when they know their abusers are shielded by powerful friends and secret files. Transparency affirms their experiences, tells them their suffering matters, and proves that society is willing to protect the vulnerable rather than the powerful. When Crockett calls for the release of files, she is demanding justice not only in a legal sense but also in a deeply human sense. Accountability acknowledges the pain of survivors and transforms it into a catalyst for change. Without transparency, that healing cannot begin, and without accountability, the cycle of abuse will only continue. Protecting victims, not abusers, must become the guiding principle in how society and its institutions address issues of sexual abuse, corruption, and secrecy. For too long, the system has been structured in a way that bends over backward to protect the reputations, careers, and social standing of abusers, while victims are forced to endure isolation, disbelief, and trauma compounded by silence. When Representative Jasmine Crockett demands that the focus shift, she is exposing a grim reality. Institutions have historically chosen to shield the guilty because it is easier, more convenient, and less disruptive than confronting the ugly truth. Protecting predators allows the machinery of power to continue running smoothly, while protecting victims would require accountability, disruption, and a realignment of priorities. This imbalance cannot continue if we are to call ourselves a just society. Protecting victims means valuing their voices, placing their needs above political interests, and recognizing that no measure of convenience or secrecy is worth sacrificing the dignity and safety of those who have suffered. The tendency to protect abusers comes from a deeply ingrained culture of denial and fear. When allegations of abuse emerge, especially against those in high positions, there is often an immediate effort to contain the damage, not to the victim but to the institution or individual accused. Files are sealed. Protecting victims also requires a fundamental change in how their stories are received. Too often, survivors are doubted, questioned, or discredited, while abusers are given the benefit of the doubt. Society frequently asks, "What proof do you have?" or "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" without recognizing the immense fear, shame, and systemic barriers that prevent victims from speaking out. Meanwhile, abusers are shielded by their influence, wealth, or status. This imbalance not only silences survivors but emboldens abusers, who know that the structures around them will shield them from consequences. To protect victims is to reverse this imbalance, to believe their voices, to investigate thoroughly and fairly, and to hold abusers accountable regardless of who they are. One of the most harmful aspects of protecting abusers is that it allows cycles of abuse to continue. Every time a predator is shielded from accountability, they are granted an opportunity to harm again. Every sealed file, every redacted name, every instance of silence creates conditions for future victims. When the system prioritizes abusers, it is not neutral, it actively endangers others by allowing abusers to remain in positions of power. Protecting victims instead of abusers means preventing further harm by ensuring that predators are removed from positions where they can exploit others. This is not simply an act of justice for past wrongs, it is an urgent act of prevention for the future. The protection of victims also demands a structural transformation in institutions that have historically failed them. Schools, churches, corporations, political bodies, and media organizations have all been complicit in enabling abuse by placing reputation above justice. Policies must be reoriented to favor transparency, accountability, and survivor support. Instead of silencing victims with non-disclosure agreements or secret settlements, institutions must adopt practices that empower survivors to come forward safely and without fear of retaliation. Resources for mental health, legal assistance, and financial support must be readily available, and survivors must be treated not as liabilities but as people who deserve dignity, respect, and protection. Crockett's demand to stop protecting pedophiles is also a call to dismantle the protective barriers that abusers hide behind. Too often, power shields them. Wealth buys silence, political connections delay investigations, and media manipulation shapes public perception in their favor. This imbalance leaves victims with almost no recourse, forcing them to confront not just their abuser but an entire system designed to discredit and exhaust them. Protecting victims requires breaking down these barriers, ensuring that power and privilege cannot override justice. Laws must be enforced equally, regardless of who is implicated, and survivors must have access to justice without being crushed by bureaucracy or bias. Shifting protection toward victims also means recognizing the long-lasting impact of abuse. Survivors live with trauma that extends far beyond the initial act, often carrying scars for years, sometimes lifetimes. The lack of protection and recognition from society adds layers of pain, as survivors feel invisible or unworthy of justice. Protecting them requires more than simply punishing abusers, it demands a compassionate system that provides healing and acknowledgement. Mental health care, public recognition of their suffering, and community support are essential. When institutions refuse to provide these, they effectively side with the abusers, reinforcing the isolation victims feel. Another dimension of this issue is cultural. In many societies, conversations about abuse are still shrouded in stigma and taboo, especially when the abuser is a respected figure. Families may discourage victims from speaking out, communities may ostracize them, and the justice system may discourage pursuit of the truth because of the social fallout. This culture of silence is one of the greatest tools abusers have. Protecting victims means changing that culture, normalizing open discussions about abuse, educating communities about the signs of predatory behavior, and teaching children that their voices will be heard and respected. Until this shift occurs, abusers will continue to thrive in the silence society provides them. Protecting victims also strengthens the moral foundation of a society. When victims are silenced, society loses its integrity because it communicates that the vulnerable are expendable. When victims are protected, however, society reinforces the values of justice, compassion, and fairness. Crockett's insistence that files be released and predators be exposed is about more than political rhetoric, it is about reaffirming the moral responsibility leaders have to prioritize the innocent over the corrupt. Protecting victims restores faith that systems of justice exist for the people, not just for the powerful. The focus on victims over abusers also creates a culture of deterrence. When abusers see that victims are protected, their voices believed, and their cases taken seriously, they recognize that the cost of exploitation is accountability. But when abusers are protected, when their files remain sealed and their crimes are buried, it signals to others that such behavior carries little risk. Protecting victims not only delivers justice to those who have suffered but also prevents future suffering by making abuse an act that carries consequences instead of rewards. In every instance, the choice is clear: protect the abuser or protect the victim. For too long, institutions have chosen the former, hiding behind excuses of legal complexity, reputational harm, or political fallout. Crockett's message calls out this moral failure and demands that the balance shift. Moral and legal responsibility must stand at the core of any response to abuse, corruption, and the protection of predators, because without them, society risks normalizing silence, complicity, and indifference. Representative Jasmine Crockett's insistence that files be released and accountability be enforced speaks directly to this point. When leaders, institutions, and systems refuse to act, they are not simply passive observers, they are active participants in a moral failure. Legal responsibility demands that laws apply equally to all, while moral responsibility calls for courage in facing uncomfortable truths even when they implicate those in positions of influence. Together, these responsibilities form the foundation of a society that claims to value justice, and when either is neglected, victims pay the price while abusers are shielded by silence and secrecy. At the heart of moral responsibility is the recognition that protecting children and vulnerable people is not optional but essential. Every sealed file that hides the identity of predators represents a decision to prioritize reputation over safety, and every official who refuses to confront abuse is complicit in allowing it to continue. Leaders carry the weight of moral authority, and when they fail to use it, they betray not only individual victims but the very communities they serve. Moral responsibility requires standing firm even when it is politically costly, socially disruptive, or personally inconvenient. It means declaring that no institution, no office, no position of power is worth more than the dignity and safety of the innocent. Legal responsibility, on the other hand, must ensure that justice is not selective. Too often, laws are enforced harshly against those without influence, while the powerful manipulate loopholes, connections, or sealed documents to escape accountability. This imbalance corrodes trust in the justice system, creating a two-tiered reality where victims are abandoned and predators thrive. Legal responsibility means that laws must be applied uniformly, regardless of wealth, social standing, or political affiliation. It means that the same system that prosecutes ordinary crimes must also have the courage to prosecute crimes of the elite. If a justice system cannot confront powerful predators, then it ceases to be just at all. The convergence of moral and legal responsibility is crucial because one without the other creates dangerous gaps. A purely legal approach, without moral grounding, risks becoming technical, bureaucratic, and indifferent to human suffering. Conversely, moral outrage without legal enforcement risks being symbolic but ineffective. True accountability requires both, the moral clarity to recognize right from wrong and the legal framework to enforce consequences. Crockett's call embodies this dual responsibility, demanding not just the exposure of files but the enforcement of justice that must follow. Institutions, in particular, carry a heightened responsibility. Whether in government, religious organizations, corporations, or schools, these bodies have often been at the center of scandals where abuse was covered up to protect reputations. Legal responsibility means they must comply with the law in releasing files, cooperating with investigations, and ceasing practices that conceal predators. Moral responsibility demands they go further, acknowledging the harm they caused, apologizing publicly, and taking proactive steps to ensure the protection of victims in the future. When institutions prioritize their image over accountability, they not only fail in their duties but also actively perpetuate harm. The moral responsibility to protect victims also extends to leaders who hold public office. Elected officials are entrusted with the duty to act in the best interest of the people, which means shielding the vulnerable rather than enabling the corrupt. When politicians protect predators or allow evidence to remain hidden, they are not neutral, they are betraying the trust placed in them by the public. The moral burden on leaders is heavy, but that is the nature of public service. Choosing silence or complicity in the face of abuse is a choice to side with injustice. By contrast, fulfilling moral and legal responsibility requires courage, even when it means exposing colleagues, allies, or powerful figures. One of the most dangerous aspects of neglecting responsibility is the signal it sends to society. When predators are shielded, when files remain sealed, when institutions hide evidence, the message is clear, that abuse can be tolerated if the abuser is powerful enough. This corrodes the fabric of society, teaching people that justice is selective and that morality can be compromised for convenience. But when moral and legal responsibility are taken seriously, the opposite message is sent, that no one is above the law, that truth will prevail, and that victims will be heard. Such a shift is not just about punishing wrongdoers, it is about reshaping societal expectations of justice. The responsibility to act also carries intergenerational weight. When society fails to confront predators, it is not just failing current victims but placing future generations at risk. Every hidden file represents the possibility of more harm, and every unpunished predator represents a threat that continues to exist unchecked. Legal responsibility ensures immediate consequences, but moral responsibility ensures that lessons are learned and structures are reformed so the cycle does not continue. Crockett's call is therefore not only about present justice but about building a safer and more transparent future where secrecy no longer enables abuse. Another key aspect of responsibility lies in confronting enablers. Predators rarely act alone, their ability to harm depends on networks of silence, complicity, and active protection. Those who knowingly protect predators, whether by hiding evidence, intimidating victims, or manipulating public opinion, carry both moral and legal culpability. Legal responsibility must hold them accountable for obstruction, negligence, or conspiracy, while moral responsibility demands that society condemns such complicity as forcefully as the abuse itself. Only by addressing both predators and their enablers can justice truly be served. Fulfilling moral and legal responsibility also requires transparency. Without transparency, responsibility becomes meaningless, as hidden truths allow abusers to escape consequences. Transparency is the bridge between moral acknowledgement and legal enforcement. It ensures that society cannot ignore what has been revealed and that victim stories are no longer buried. When files are released, when evidence is made public, moral responsibility is affirmed and legal systems are pressured to act. In this sense, transparency is not an end in itself but a vital tool to make both forms of responsibility real. Finally, moral and legal responsibility create the conditions for healing and restoration. Victims who see their abusers exposed and held accountable are given validation that their suffering mattered. Communities that witness justice being served regain faith in their institutions. Leaders who act on their responsibilities inspire trust that public service is still grounded in principle rather than corruption. Responsibility is therefore not abstract, it has tangible effects on the lives of survivors, the strength of communities, and the integrity of nations. By demanding accountability, Crockett is not simply calling for files to be released, she is calling for a renewal of the moral and legal commitments that uphold justice itself.